So by the time I arrived at Fort Bragg in 1995, early 95 timeframe, I'd already spent just years learning how to become a soldier. So as you saw in the previous episodes, I survived basic training, airborne school, Fort Lewis, Alaska, and Ranger School. So I knew how to work hard. I knew how to endure, but I still hadn't found where I truly belonged. So then I arrived at this small unit, long range surveillance unit, that served as the eyes and ears of the 18th Airborne Corps. The standards were higher, the expectations were different, and for the first time in my Army career, I found myself surrounded by people who viewed the mission the same way I did. So I didn't know it then, but I had just arrived at a place where that would shape me over the next 4.5 years of my life. This is long range surveillance. Let's get into it. Every mission has a beginning, and every journey has a purpose. This is Zeroed In. All right. So welcome back, everyone. And it's been a few months since I actually had done one of these. I just had a lot of irons in the fire, doing a whole lot of stuff. So kind of pick up where we left off. This is episode 5A. This is long range surveillance. Basically, this is where I found myself and where I needed to be in the Army at the time. So like I said in the intro, I arrived at Fort Bragg early in 1995, and I reported to 19th Replacement Detachment. That's where soldiers go to when they report into Fort Bragg that are going somewhere other than the 82nd Airborne Division. So I spent about 4 days there before moving on to Delta Company, 519th MI Battalion, which was the original unit designation. And before it transitioned into Foxtrot Company, 51st Infantry LURS, long range surveillance, a couple of months later. The unit was a direct reconnaissance asset for the 18th Airborne Corps, and I'll get into that a little bit later and what that means. So over almost 4.5 years in the unit, I finally found a place to call home. This is where I truly felt like I fit in. But it took some time to realize it. Not a whole lot of time, but it took some time. This wasn't just another airborne infantry unit. This was a specialized unit in the art of reconnaissance, surveillance, communication, air, land, and sea capabilities. This unit, it provided training and school opportunities that no other infantry unit could provide, strictly based on its mission sets. So the maturity level and the IQ of each member in the unit had to be beyond reproach. I mean, as a mission, it demanded a greater responsibility than most conventional units would be tasked with. So, for example, and just kind of running down this, so a private first class, so somebody that's been in the Army maybe 2 years, maybe 1.5 to 2 years, a private first class in an airborne unit is typically charged with just maintaining their weapon, their assigned weapon, and kind of learning their role in a fire team. A private first class in long-range surveillance unit is charged with knowing their role as both a multifaceted communications expert with FM, HF, UHF, that's high frequency, ultra high frequency, and satellite communication devices, along with encryption and decryption standards, as well as surveillance and mission support site operations. It sounds like a whole lot right there, but believe it or not, that's just a small category of what is demanded of all the people in the unit, or all the team members in the unit. So kind of go into it. So everyone on a team, they must be, if you kind of put this into perspective, like competency-wise, they must be at a near expert level of proficiency in land navigation, operations order processing, camouflage techniques, link up operations, both friendly and partisan, call for fire operations, such as aerial, naval, and conventional, like artillery fire, foreign weapons and vehicle recognition. They're assigned specialized infiltration slash exfiltration techniques. And let's not forget, about the level of physical and mental fitness that's required to accomplish those missions, all those missions that come down. So for the civilian population, to kind of get you to relate to this, if you've never served, or kind of imagine a 6-man team operating deep ahead of larger forces, friendly forces, operating unseen, passing back critical information while avoiding contact in a foreign country's territory. That's what it is. That's what 6 people are charged with doing, and it was just an absolutely fun mission. So over the next 2 episodes, I'm going to share mission objectives, team types, serious and funny stories that I've encountered during that time, and specific roles I played in the unit. And there are many, so stick around. So, all right, so I met my team kind of going to the beginning of kind of when I arrived. I met my team for the first time when they jumped back into Fort Bragg on Sicily drop zone after they spent a couple weeks operating out of Marfa, Texas, conducting counter-drug surveillance operations at the border. This is when I knew I was in the right environment of like-minded individuals, mission-driven individuals and teams. I believe this is the jump. I think, Vercon, if you're listening, I think this is the jump where he broke his back in, and that's where I met him. So, Vercon, if you're watching the show, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is where, when you guys jumped back in, when you broke your back. So I'm kind of giving you a little memory on this as well. So my team leader, so before I get into this, so put this into perspective. This was early 95. So I'm still 22 years old. I'm going to be 23 in a couple months. And my team leader at the time, he was in his 40s. He was from Antigua. He was an avid soccer player, and he just stayed in phenomenal cardio shape. Every single Monday for team training, team physical training in the morning, we would go on what's called an LSD run. Not for the drug heads out there, but that's otherwise known as long, slow distance. So there's some key words in this thing: long, slow distance. This was a 10-mile route. It was definitely long and anything but slow. We would take off from the company area. So those are kind of familiar with Fort Bragg back in the 90s. Would take off from the company area, which was in the old World War II barracks. So believe it or not, even in the 90s, the barracks that they built during World War II were still there, and we all utilized those in our company area and our team rooms. So we'd take off from the company area, and at the time, our company area was it was situated in between Pike Field, so those familiar with Fort Bragg, Pike Field and Pope Air Force Base, that's what it was named at the time, before later on that they had changed the name to Pope Army Airfield, but that was years and years later. And then we would head out on Manchester Road, then to Lamont, so we'd hang a left on the Lamont Road, then to McKellar's Road, and then come back down Pratt Street, back into, the team room area and company area. So that's where we'd finish up at. But sometimes we'd go a little bit further, and, we would take, we'd go a little bit further down Lamont, which would turn into, on the left side, you had Cooliconch Mountain, which was also known as Lamont Landfill, and then back to the team room. So that extra distance just added a little more sprinkle of a terrain change and pain. So that route wasn't for the weak or the faint of heart. I remember the first time we ran that route, we finished in, I think it was just under 60 minutes. So you got to figure we averaged a sub 6-minute mile. I always felt like I was in decent shape, but that run kind of took it to a whole new level for me as far as what was expected, what everybody was expected, especially on a water team. And we'll get into that in a minute. But Anyway, so our team rooms, they were in old World War II style barracks, kind of like I talked about. The way they were situated were they were two-story buildings with 6 rooms, I believe, per floor, which, 2 stories, 6 rooms per floor, and a community bathroom on each floor. And I swear the ceilings, they were still filled with asbestos insulation at the time. And I got a story about how we found that out later on. But anyway, so we kept all our mission gear in the team room, including our rucksacks, our load-bearing equipment, the vests, the non-sensitive mission-related gear, such as shovels, PVC piping, ghillie suits, camouflage making material, spray paint, et cetera, you name it. So anything we needed to be able to help, facilitate our mission to be able to take out to on the missions that we were conducting. So all that equipment. So our platoon had 5 teams at the time. I was in 3rd platoon, and we were up on the 2nd floor of the first building outside the company area. And I believe 2nd platoon was on the 1st floor. So anyway, our platoon had 5 teams. So the extra room on our floor was used to kind of store like extra equipment, MREs, and et cetera. And also we used it kind of like our study room. So we would go in there and use it to be able to study like vehicle and weapon recognition using an overhead projector. So if you can picture, like, remember the old, like the little square film pieces that would go into the round projector thing, and you had a little remote there, and it would turn the wheel and it would project like different things up onto the screen. We used that room. That's where we studied opposing forces, other countries' vehicles, anti-tank vehicles, or tanks, different types of tanks, wheeled vehicles, vehicles that carried missiles and stuff like that, surface-to-air missiles, surface-to-air artillery, stuff like that, weapons, anything handheld weapons. We would study all of these foreign weapons because as we went out on missions, especially if we were going to be operating in a foreign country, we want to be able to see what type of weapon systems that they're utilizing, and we can't, call out what type of weapon systems back to base that they're using if we don't study up on it and figure out what they're using during that time. So we had to become very, very proficient at that time, at that stuff. So anyway, so being the new guy on the team, especially as a young sergeant, remember in the previous episode, just before I left Alaska, I was promoted to sergeant. So I got to this unit as a sergeant. So, and then we also had younger guys and lower rank guys who had been in the unit for a couple of years. So it was a little intimidating at first, especially since I was immediately filling a senior scout role. So coming from line infantry units, I knew a lot about small unit, like offensive and defensive tactics. However, just realizing that getting into a firefight, or even better yet, trying to understand the concept of not getting into or not finding, fixing, and finishing, which is like your 3 F's in the infantry: finding, fixing, and finishing. But you couldn't do that in this realm. You couldn't do that in this line of work. It was paramount to survival. So I had to learn real quick and adapt even quicker to the life of reconnaissance and intelligence gathering and confirmation. So, like I said, operating 6-man teams, it's not like we had a full platoon out there, hardened battle-ready infantry unit to just go out and destroy everything. So I was in a totally environment, different mission set. So in a line infantry unit, we were trained to use weapons such as pistols, rifles, light and medium machine guns. In this unit, the heaviest weapon we carried was a rifle with a grenade launcher on it, the M203. So no squad automatic weapons, which was the 249 in the infantry. The no M60, no M240, 240 Bravo, 240 Golf. No 50 caliber weapon systems like the M2, the 50 cal Modus, or the Mark 19, which is back then your automatic grenade launcher, your AGL. to help protect the team in the event of contact. As a matter of fact, if we came in contact, kind of like what I was talking about, the mission would have changed dramatically from reconnaissance and intelligence gathering to initiating our evasion plan for extraction. For 4 years, I had been trained, prior to coming there, I'd been trained that when you find the enemy, you close with and destroy them. In long range surveillance, if you were getting into a firefight, something had already gone wrong. That is not a good look for a unit that is specially trained in stealth techniques. So besides, it would be quite difficult to remain stealthy and timely if the teams were to carry systems intended or meant to be crew-served weapon systems. Not to mention, as you get heavier in the weapon systems, whether it be the 249, the squad automatic weapon, everybody knows it's a very loud weapon. The bipods frequently, are banging, clinging against the plastic handguard. There are ways around it. You could tape the stuff down, but for us, in order to remain light, because we carried some heavy loads, some heavy backpacks. If you've never heard the term the Lurch Ruck, each guy, whenever we went on a mission, we probably carried an average of 90 pounds at least. The RTOs, RTO and ARTO, those guys are carrying, well over 100 pounds of gear. So it was just, you couldn't add any more weight on weapon systems as well. So when it came to radio use, we had to use radios. So obviously that was our main line of communication. So I was pretty proficient in FM communications prior to getting to the unit. But I quickly found that since our mission was to operate anywhere between 150 and 300 kilometers beyond the friendly lines, we had to communicate via radio systems designed for greater range. I was quickly introduced to the UHF, VHF systems and satellite communication systems. These were different animals. I had to learn how to cut frequencies for UHF communications, which meant understanding how to calculate antenna lengths based on range, frequency, the type of antenna we needed. Could be the ELPA wire, the grade 50, whether it be just a long wire that would throw out made of the old Claymore wire with a resistor on the end. I mean, that was just kind of field expedient type, but you had to understand on how to calculate and cut those based on the frequency you were using, and then understand the terrain we were operating in and ensuring that we could communicate within the designated time window that we were given during planning. And with satellite communications, had to understand azimuths in both ground and vertical. And I could go on and give a class in antenna theory, but we'll save that for later. You had to be super proficient in radio communications. No matter what type of communications they laid out, you had to be near expert on those. So whether you were the designated RTO, ARTO, everybody in the team cross-trained. So that way, if somebody went down, next person up grabs the gear, and they immediately know how to use it and put it into operation. So for the first couple of years that I was there, the platoons, they were structured pretty evenly. Each platoon, I think I mentioned earlier, there was 5 to 6 teams of 6 personnel each. Each platoon had 2 water teams, 2 free fall teams, and 2 what we called multi-purpose / ruck teams. When I first got there, I was first assigned to a water team. This is where I found out real fast why our physical fitness, especially our cardio and mental toughness, had to be at their best. I mean, it's kind of like that long, slow distance run I was talking about with the 10-mile run right off the rip, as soon as I get there. And I'm like, oh my goodness. So, and then being on a water team, you had to understand or understood pretty quickly why we had to be in shape. So before I get into the nitty gritty of mission specifics, I just want to highlight that all the teams had the same mission. It was in the core sense of things: reconnaissance, surveillance, target acquisition, and battle damage assessment. Those are basically the four big things that we constantly trained on, at least during that time. That's what we were charged with. So, however, the main difference in the grand scheme of things was the insertion techniques. Free fall teams, they were specially qualified to conduct high altitude, low opening operations, HALO operations, or HAHO operations, high altitude, high opening. They could jump from an aircraft, with all assigned mission and equipment at altitudes ranging from 10,000 feet to 25,000 feet, under oxygen, and depending on the various operational factors, depending on, just kind of little things right off the top of my head. So, depending on the terrain, depending on the enemy awareness, or, the where we were going into, what was the awareness of the opposing forces level, what type of, initial reconnaissance systems did they have, to where, we had to go from a HALO mission to a HAHO mission. You're jumping from 25,000 feet, you open up at 20. So that way at night, everything is more pronounced at night, in the hearing, can't really see, but you can hear things a whole lot better at night. And then, you're not going to really hear 6 chutes opening at 20,000 feet on the ground, from the ground, I should say. But if we jump from 10,000 feet and we're opening at, 4,000 feet, you can hear those canopies snapping open, and then that's going to alert everybody on the ground. So, water teams, we were trained to conduct over the horizon insertions in the ocean up to 20 nautical miles offshore. That is a long way. So anybody that looks at a map, a nautical mile is a whole lot further than a single statute mile. What we see every day, what our vehicles calculate, nautical miles or statute miles. So 20 nautical miles, that's even further out into the ocean. And then once we were dropped off out there, we had to then navigate to within a 200 meter wide drop point along the shoreline, like a 200 meter window. So, you're being dropped off 20 nautical miles out, but you had to navigate to within a 200 meter drop point, a specific drop point on the ground. So, and then once you get there, you had to hide all that nautical equipment, into we called the hinterland, which is, those who have been to the beach before, that, you got the water that meets the shoreline, and then from the shoreline, you've got the sand, and then the sand kind of leads up to the woods, or the trees. That's where the hinterland is. So we actually, you can't just leave your boat and all your equipment out there for anybody to find. So we actually had to stealthily learn how to move all that gear into the woodline and camouflage all that too. So, multi-purpose and ruck teams, they would, normally conduct either traditional airborne operations or airborne insertions or helicopter insertions. And sometimes, and then from there, sometimes they would do what we called non-standard insertions, which I've done on a few different operations, where maybe you're hitching a ride through through a partisan, where you're catching a vehicle ride to be able to get through a certain checkpoint and get beyond to where you can be dropped off. So, but and one of the other things too is they could proceed on foot from a designated passage of lines route. So, whether it's a friendly passage of lines going through, and then you meet up with a partisan, they get you to a certain point, and then you continue on. So, however, I'll explain how this company structure eventually changed later on. So like I said, in the beginning, the unit designation when I first arrived was Delta Company 519th MI, or Military Intelligence Battalion. We were the 18th Airborne Corps' main reconnaissance asset for the Corps Commanding General. So the 18th Airborne Corps, kind of put this into perspective, because I know there's a lot of people that may listen to this and be like, Rick, what the heck's the 18th Airborne Corps, and what does that mean? So 18th Airborne Corps, it is the big, large, element of a unit that consisted of all conventional units at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, Fort Drum, New York, Fort Campbell, Kentucky, and Fort Stewart, Georgia. So you got 4 large bases that fall under the 18th Airborne Corps in the purview of the 18th Airborne Corps commander, which at that time was General Hugh Shelton. We were there, however, we were the primary reconnaissance and intelligence gathering / confirmation asset, at General Shelton's disposal. So more on his influence on the unit later on, and then also on my influence in order to be able to kind of do a public speaking. So we'll get into that a little bit later on. So when I first arrived, our company commander, Mark Meadows, he had just taken over from Major Fuller, two very well-known guys in the infantry community. Our first sergeant, Ellis, he was a great administrative first sergeant who focused on his efforts more on securing better opportunities for the men in the company than being out in the field to ensure that the teams were tactically sound. And that wasn't an uncommon situation. Some first sergeants, they're just more administratively focused, while others are more tactically focused. Sometimes command teams, they're better suited like that. However, this was about to change after about my first month in the unit. So let me take a swig of coffee before I get into this. All right. So now we're going to enter First Sergeant Moore, a.k.a. Big Mike. Wow. The company, this is where the company changed a lot. So prior to First Sergeant Moore's arrival, the company had kind of a prima donna swag to it. And the way I'll kind of lay this out is, so there were guys who had been in the unit since its early beginnings in like the early 90s. And it was well known that the training and schooling opportunities that our unit could access were head and tail above those in any conventional units in the entire 18th Airborne Corps. I mean, hands down. Guys walked around with egos like nobody could touch them. Some guys were more fixated on how many schools they attended than actually honing their craft and becoming the best leaders that they could be. So granted, the training missions, the mission capabilities, schooling, physical fitness, freedom of maneuver to travel for commexes or communication exercises, they were all perks to serving in that unit. But certain aspects of discipline, they were out the window. And kind of go back, so commex. So once again, I kind of briefly mentioned it before, you had to be really proficient at all your radio systems. So when I first got there, there was a pretty cool, what do you call it? One of the things that we could do in the company was, so the way the company is situated, we had the mission platoons, right? Then you had an operations section, then you had a combo platoon, then you had your headquarters platoon, which had your armorers. You had your boathouse for all where we kept all our Zodiac boats and stuff like that. So you had a lot of support personnel in there. So what we would do is put in for like the teams to be able to travel. So I think one team went down to Key West, and then the whole mission on that is they go down there and they just try to communicate with all the different communication systems all the way back to Fort Bragg. A couple other teams went to like Pennsylvania. I think another team went to the mountains. It was pretty cool. So when I'm talking about guys kind of letting things get to their head, it's because we had opportunities to be able to do stuff like that you would never see anywhere in any other conventional unit. So I kind of want to expound on that a little bit. So yes, we were a specialized unit, and everyone should be proud of the level of competence that they achieved. But there's a fine line between egoism and confidence. So, and I've always believed in that. So in April of '95, First Sergeant Mike Moore, he arrived on scene to replace First Sergeant Ellis. So prior to First Sergeant Moore's arrival, guys were already coming down on orders for other places. This is kind of funny. So First Sergeant Moore, he had known a few people who were dripping with ego per se, and he definitely did not want them in a unit when he arrived. He was a different breed, he was a different animal. So rumor has it, he made some phone calls to Ranger Branch to get some people, quote unquote, relocated before and shortly after he got to the unit. So I believe, I want to say, I could be mistaken, but Mike, if you were watching this, I want to say he was coming from JRTC, the Joint Readiness Training Center, down in Fort Bragg, Louisiana at the time. So I'm not 100% sure, but I think he was. He was an OC or an observer controller down there. And for him to be able to come to this unit, it was huge. I mean, he absolutely loved it. But then again, he was a very high standard guy, or high standards, standard bearing, and high, look, you better meet the standards. And that's what, to me, from a person who first got there, what the unit actually needed. So him coming in and him seeing the roster of the guys that were there, and there was a lot of people that, he pretty much got them, he let them go prior to him getting there and while he got there. So it was, and I think I'll hit on this a little bit later on of the type of unit this was as well. So, but First Sergeant Moore, he was definitely the complete opposite of First Sergeant Ellis. His utopia, as far as First Sergeant Moore, was being in the field and making sure the teams were tactically sound. They were doing their jobs. He had his hands in on everything. Not in the sense of micromanaging. He was definitely not a micromanager. He was passionate about making sure that guys survived. And how do you survive? By honing your craft to the best of your ability, to where you're making the best decisions out there, you're doing everything correctly, you're out there camouflaging yourself properly, not just the team's not going out, they walk all night and then they don't, allocate time to be able to set up for camouflaging themselves during the day for a rest over day, or what we call ROD, right? So, guys just kind of letting things hang out, just they could be found easily and seen, not putting antennas down, putting stuff away, making sure that they were still camouflaged, making sure that if they did walk or move around, that there was no, there was a lot of noise discipline. So, not that he was micromanaging, but in the sense that standards would always be adhered to. I believe he was able to handpick, I think, if I remember right, he was able to handpick his platoon sergeants and allowed them to train their teams with minimal intervention. He did have a say in who became team leaders in his company, though, because he knew that where the rubber met the road was the team leader for who was leading those teams on those missions. So it was their job, them and the ATL, or the assistant team leader, but more importantly, in his eyes, the team leader. So the way it was, the structure was, the team leader was typically the staff sergeant, the ATL and the senior scout were both sergeants. And then from there, your regular scout, your RTO, your ARTO, and let me see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then your other scouts. So 2 senior scout, 2 scouts, ATL, 2 RTOs, and the team leader. So, so 6 personnel. And but he wanted to make sure that, I believe that he was definitely in the handpicking process for whoever's leading those teams out on missions. So, which I don't blame him, because I mean there were staff sergeants there who were definitely not even ready to be team leaders, and we're just going out there to kind of mess around and, for lack of a better term, joke around and pussyfoot out there and not actually focus on their job and keeping men alive. So, while the ruckus of all the leadership changes were underway, those of us who continue to live by the Ranger Creed every day and came to work every day giving 100% and then some, we focused primarily on improving our craft. One thing I did not mention at the beginning was the culture and the qualifications of the unit's members. So we'll kind of break that down real fast. So all non-commissioned officers and officers must have completed Ranger School and served with distinction in their previous units. Okay. However, the occasional NCO would be assigned to the unit without having attended Ranger School. And it was the policy that the NCO would attend Ranger School within 90 days of arrival at the unit. I think there was some wiggle room left and right. However, in order to be on a team, NCOs could not serve on an operational team without having completed Ranger School. It was just a mandatory requirement. this was non-negotiable. There were other positions within the company that they could have served in, and they were needed. But working on a team was definitely out of the question. Junior enlisted members, like E4 and below, they could serve on an operational team, but they too would at some point be provided a slot to attend the Ranger course, and if not, they'd be reassigned to another unit. So now this doesn't mean like you go down there, you fail out, come back, and you're booted out. I mean, it's not quite like that. However, guys will be given ample opportunity to go down and be successful. However, there's only so many strikes that you're going to get. Or if you had an NCO that come into the unit and they just straight up said, and they were an infantry guy, and they straight up said, "No, I'm not going to Ranger School," then you're not staying in the unit. We're moving you somewhere else, because it was one of the prerequisites that and one of the policies of the unit. So after serving in line infantry units for 4 years before joining the long range surveillance unit, it was somewhat of a culture shock upon arrival. I loved it, but it was kind of a culture shock. So those who have never served in a very tight knit unit, specialized unit, that you found it strange that team members would, for the most part, call each other by your first name. So what I mean by that is everything in a regular line infantry unit was uniform and strict adherence to speaking by rank structure. And all NCOs were addressed as Sergeant so-and-so. Specialists and corporals were addressed by the ranks as well, for the most part. However, there were limits in this unit. So I would never have addressed my platoon sergeant, or especially my first sergeant, by their first name. So today, I could call, First Sergeant Moore Mike, because we're both out of the military. We both had some, have shared experiences that we communicate, often, and, it'd be kind of odd for me to be calling him First Sergeant. He was during that time in my career. I eventually retired as a First Sergeant, so it would be kind of funny if I was still calling him First Sergeant. But we're kind of on that level where, but during that time, as a young 23-year-old guy, 23-year-old guy, calling my first sergeant by his first name, not happening, especially even my platoon sergeants, not happening. And I knew my platoon sergeants. When I first got there, the platoon sergeant I had when I first got there, he was a Ranger instructor down in 6th RTB, which I'll get to later on in another episode when I became a Ranger instructor later on. But 6th Ranger Training Brigade down in the swamps in Florida, I believe it was Sergeant Ballou. He was my platoon sergeant when I first got there, and then right after him was Sergeant Banton, which once again he was also down there, I believe, during Ballou's time as well. And but so it was kind of funny, like seeing these guys. And the infantry it's a very small world. So anyway, but respect in that aspect was never a line to be crossed when you're talking about addressing people, whether it be by their first names or how you addressed them, by their rank. So that definitely wasn't a line to be crossed. However, peer to peer, yeah, I'd be like, "Hey, Ron," or "Hey, Ken," or whomever, it doesn't matter. That's just the way we spoke. Coming from line unit, though, it was a little weird. Like I said, it was kind of a culture shock, but you kind of got used to it after a while. All right, so within about 90 to 120 days of First Sergeant Moore's arrival, the company, we decided we needed some type of like weeding out process for the future, for both at that time and the future. I mean, just kind of like we needed to set a very tough standard, to make sure that people who were coming here, one, wanted to be there. They had to give 100% and then some, and then also making sure that when they go through this process, we're going to make sure that they mentally and physically fit to be able to endure the missions that we were getting ready to go on. So at least in the interim, this was going to be a kind of a, let's see where your physicality is at type assessment, right? So we put together, or the operations section put together, a 4-day long assessment process. It was developed by like a very small committee of guys. And day one, if my memory kind of serves me right, it was kind of went something like this. So day one, it consisted of the Ranger physical fitness test, the PT test, which included push-ups, sit-ups, 2-mile run, and pull-ups. And then shortly after that was a 500-meter swim, the swim test in BDUs and boots, so in your daily uniform. And then day two consisted of, I believe it was a 5-mile run and an unknown distance ruck event. So, heavy rucksack. So you go run 5 miles, come back, get your gear on, and then you're going on like an unknown distance, ruck, with your rucksack, unknown distance. And there's a reason behind that. And I'll kind of get into that later. But anyway, day 3 was a 30-kilometer orienteering course. So basically a very wide range navigation course, right? Land nav course, except you're not trying to find specific, like, within 1 meter or 2 meter, grids, trying to find a point. You get into an area, and then in that area, there's going to be, you're going to move over to where these different tasks are being, set up. So anyway, it was a 30-kilometer orienteering course with 5 checkpoints along the way. Each of the checkpoints, they're requiring you to complete a different task before moving on to the next. So the kicker of all this, and this is what's kind of cool, because it did actually come back later on, because I got so used to doing this over and over again. Later on, when I joined the SWAT team, we actually had this event in there as well. Not the 30K, not the 30K march, but the kicker is before the start of the 30K march, or the 30K course, was a game called Kim's, Keep in Mind, right? Keep in Mind game. So you would take about 10 to 12, just random military items, whether it's a camo stick and a compass, maybe set at a certain azimuth. Maybe you had like a Skillcraft pen. Maybe you had a protractor. Maybe you had a portion of an MRE, whatever it may be. But either way, you had, 10 to 12 items inside of there. Inside like they were all placed in this old military style footlocker. So those who remember those footlockers, it was kind of like that. So each person would be given exactly 1 minute to study the items inside the locker. So, as soon as whoever was running that portion, they said go, they would lift up the lid on that and you'd see the items there, right? So you could not touch the items. You could not write anything down about the items. And when you head out, so that way, while you're there, you can't just like be making sketches, of the items that are in there. Everything is a mind. Everything had to be, kept up here. And there's a reason why later on we'll get into it. But, and then after that minute, the locker, they would close it down and you would head out on your navigational path to your first checkpoint. So, somewhere along that 30K route, you'd be tasked with providing the most accurate and detailed sketch possible about what you saw in that locker, okay? So if you pulled out any drawings or notes that you had written down, like say once you left, out of sight of the person that was running that station, you're an automatic failure. That's it, bottom line. The point of the exercise, it was to kind of hone your skills in remembering everything you saw in the target locker. So that way, when you're providing those details during the debrief, just like any team member would do in a real operation, even if they were the lone survivor. So the reason for that is, so if you're on, like if I'm on a surveillance team on an objective or on a target for 4 days, and I've been studying, I may have some notes I wrote down or whatnot, on a live mission, but then those notes I'm going to end up destroying anyway. I have to be able to maintain everything up here, because as we move out, and so let's just say we get compromised during exfiltration, even during extraction, and guys go down, we have to be able to retain that. So when we get back to sit down with our intelligence section to be able to do a debrief on what we saw on that target, we have to be able to remember that stuff in detail. So that's the purpose of the game, that task that we had to do. But like I said, somewhere along that 30K route, you didn't know when it was going to pop up that they would ask you. So like I said, during those 30K route, you may be tasked with doing, putting together, and it was all like stuff that was mind driven, so maybe we were calculating how much C4 we needed to be able to put for a specific type of charge, whether it's a tree cutting charge or an I-beam charge. You're doing mathematical problems in your head, right? And all the while, you still have to keep all of the items that you saw in that box in your head. You can't have any of it written down. And then maybe the next point, you were cutting frequencies, cutting antenna lengths to different frequencies that you were doing. And then maybe at the third point, you were looking at a mock target setup through binoculars, and you had to be able to figure out everything that was on that little target and then relay that information back. And then at the fourth, checkpoint, which could be, 20 to 25 kilometers, since you saw that box, is when they test you on it. So the purpose of that is to keep your mind off of what you saw. Like, they're trying to influence through small tasks on how it can boggle your mind, but you have to be able to learn how to be able to steel trap all that stuff. And one of the best ways we found to do that in the Kim's game, or at least for me, was to take a structural or use some type of structure to go from, like if you were reading a book, go from left to right, top to bottom, and then just look at everything in there and just figure out, okay, where was it at? What position was it sitting in and whatnot? So anyway, but that was all of day 3. Day 4 consists of, day 4 wasn't anything physical. Day 4 consisted of mental testing, like the other 3 days weren't, right? So it consisted of mental testing, including the Wonderlic cognitive ability test, the MMPI personality test, and I believe there was like just some obscure or some random essay that you had to write in there about some obscure topic. It was just weird. It was everything was mental. So if anybody's ever taken the Wonderlic, I think that's like 50 questions and it's based on time. And then you had a certain amount of time to be able to answer these questions. I don't know if it calculates your IQ. I have no idea, but, and then the MMPI, it's like the Minnesota something, initiative or whatever. It's a personality test. And there was it's like almost 600 questions, like 500 and some odd questions. And it'll ask you random things like, would you rather kill a bug or paint flowers? It's just weird type stuff. So anyway, the day 4 is like your all mental day. And then what we did is we had psychologists or whoever was qualified to read all that stuff, and then they would give all the results to the company commander later on. So, and then at the cumulative, after all 4 days were over, based off of how you did throughout that week, all the results would go to the commander, and then they would make decisions on, whether or not somebody needed retraining on something, or later on, when I get into episode 5B, I'll talk about what actually took place if somebody didn't meet the requirement or meet the standards for the assessment. So anyway, those were 4 fun days that most people look forward to. Believe it or not, I did, because to me, it was, you knew what was going to happen. You knew what was going to go on. You might not know the tasks in between, like along the 30K route, because those always changed. But, and maybe they flip-flopped the swim test with the 5-mile run one day or whatnot. Either way, it was all very similar tasks. I always look forward to it because, to me, I looked at it as a competition, not amongst my peers, but also for myself. So I want to, always do better on that. Not to mention, there were other schools, and we'll get to this in episode 5B, where our unit became a pipeline for special forces courses and guys going over to Delta Force. And there's a reason why we had all this in line, and why everybody kind of pushed themselves. So So we're going to kind of take like a quick step to the side, um, and kind of take it away from operational stuff to life in the barracks. So life in the barracks in a large unit was always eventful. Um, so when I first got there, our barracks, we were located on Smoke Bomb Hill. So if anybody's familiar with Fort Bragg, Smoke Bomb Hill was right next to All American Highway. This was way before Fort Bragg became a closed unit or a closed base. Closed, Fort Bragg in the 90s, prior to 9/11, was an open base, which means there was no gates to get in. The All American Highway ran right into it, and our barracks were right along the side of All American Highway. So it was easy to get in, easy to get out. So going out partying and not knowing who drove or how we got anywhere or back to the barracks was crazy. And it was easy since, we didn't have to stop for any, MP checkpoints or anything. So we worked very hard in that unit, but we partied even harder. At least it seemed like. So Big Mike, if you're watching this, because I have some stories I think I might bring up in 5B that I know will resonate with you. So we worked, there was a lot of mornings when we'd meet up in someone's barracks room after partying all night. And whoever had all the IV bags in their rooms, the intravenous, solution bags. So that way we could go down there and we could, rehydrate intravenously before starting up, for that night, the next night again. Since we continuously trained in trauma care, IV IV bags and catheters, they're always at our disposal. So, we just take turns administering IVs to each other, whether it was 2 500 milliliter bags or 1,000 milliliter bag, whatever it took to get back to normal. So, and then we'd be ready, boom, to go back out and, party again that night. So quick disclaimer, I don't condone this at all for any of my younger family members who may watch this video. It's kind of like one of those, you play stupid games, win stupid prizes, but you learn. So as you get older, you mature. Even though we were mature in our job, we just may not have been as mature when we were out partying. So at least we found steps to recover from that before moving on to the next day versus just laying in bed all day, dehydrated and, whatnot. So Myrtle Beach trips, they were a must for us. Myrtle Beach was about 2 hours southeast of us. As I said, we partied hard. So when we weren't on mission cycle or involved in training on the weekends, we found ourselves in Myrtle Beach. We would have one guy rent a single room, or all of us would just crash on the beach itself. So, or, nightlife in Myrtle Beach in the mid-90s, it was pretty abundant, more than it is today. So if you go down there today, it's not really a whole lot of nightlife, but if you go along the back in the 90s along the strip, I mean, there was club after club after club. And for guys like us who were kind of wound up, working so hard, all the time, and then boom, on the weekends, that's where we went and just let loose. Like I said, found ourselves a lot of mornings, or we go down there without any hotel reservations or anything and just crash on the beach. So plus it was more of like a, we really didn't care. I mean, we were infantry guys, we were grunts. We didn't care where we slept. So it didn't matter. So since I was assigned to a water team, we trained pretty hard on our specialized tasks. I had to understand small boat operations, scout swimmer operations and duties, personal water survival equipment, and helocast operations, as well as personnel and equipment insertion. So I kind of summed those up in the beginning, but now we're kind of getting into the nitty gritty of the actual specific water teams. So this was just the beginning. So first and foremost, it was the insane shape we had to be in to be able to perform our mission essential tasks. So besides the long, slow distance runs we went on, the 10 milers, we would also run with our water gear, fins, masks, etc., the BCs, to the outdoor pool at one of the gyms on base. And that was a few miles away from the team room. So you got a really good run in all the way there, carrying all this equipment. And in the summertime, we would wear UDT shorts, those brown, ugly UDT shorts where, and then our jungle boots. So that was kind of like the summer uniform. Once we get to the pool, we'd usually start with like a 500-meter swim without our equipment, and then, kind of warm up, and then transition into what seemed like a million flutter kicks with our legs extended out over the pool, with the fins on, and our feet, the fins, we had them on our feet. We had our masks on, and we would have to fill the masks up with water. So you'd run your mask in the water, put it on as you're laying back, put it on. So this way you were kind of training on breathing only through your mouth. So when we were done with those, we'd kind of go into a really fun crossover event. And actually, I say that almost, facetiously, but I actually loved this. This was awesome. This is one of my best things, as far as water training events that I really love doing. So we got into what was called crossovers. So anybody has done that before, you know how painful that can become, but at the same time, it can be very rewarding too for your overall cardio fitness. So like I said, I loved these things. So this is where team members, so if you picture this, right, picture a pool, the left and right sides. So you got the length of the pool and then you get the sides. So you're in the deep end. So the whole team's in the deep end, and you got half the team on one side and another team starting on the other side, right? So on command, everyone would swim below the surface while one group stayed high, which when I say high, we're talking like between 2 to 3 feet below the surface of the water. And the other group that's coming over is swimming as low as they can down to the bottom of the pool, right? So basically we call it crossover. So you got one group coming down, right? And another one coming across. So basically you're swimming one group on top, one underneath, and then you come back up and just you'd be swapping sides, right? So, so basically you could run this in different ways, but one of the things that we did, one technique we did was when the first guy reached the other side and came up for air, he would wait for the last person to resurface. That's why it always paid to be the first guy up. So he would wait for the last person to resurface. And then once that last person resurfaced, we went again. This time, the top guys went all the way to the bottom, and the bottom guys, did the 2 to 3 feet below the surface, and we just crossed over again, right? We ran this drill for probably a good 20 to 30 minutes. This drill was especially good for building lung capacity and confidence in the water. So this was a typical day in the life of a water team guy, as far as in the morning getting this done. Or if we, had to do other tasks in the morning, and we had time to go do pool work, boom, we were doing stuff like that. So it was, that was really fun. Like I said, it would always pay to be the first guy, but there's other techniques on way to do that too. Other water teams wouldn't just be like the first guy waiting. So sometimes, depending on the cardio fitness level, making sure that we can get guys to where they need to be. Maybe when everybody came, you waited for everybody, the first guy would wait for everybody to come up. And then from there, you'd be like a 10-second countdown, and then everybody went again, okay? But you'd never want it to be the last guy, and that was the number one deal. So in late August, so we're kind of fast forwarding through between the April-May timeframe. We did a lot of training between then. As far as I'm soaking in everything like a sponge. Like I said, coming from regular line unit to trying to learn all these tasks, all this stuff. So in late August through September '95, we attended the Marine Corps Amphibious Reconnaissance School at Fort Story, Virginia, specifically the Scout Swimmer course. This is a pretty intensive course at the time, where we learned to conduct survival water survival, we learned to conduct nautical navigation utilizing the D Street formula, distance equals speed times time. Distance, when we dropped off, so I'll kind of give you an example of how this formula comes to play on navigation in the water. So when we were dropped off by a Chinook helicopter over 20 nautical miles into the Atlantic Ocean, we had to navigate from our drop point to within, like I said in the beginning, to like a 200-meter pre-planned spot on the shoreline. So you're way out. I mean, we're talking 20 nautical miles out. If you can picture this, so if you've never been that far out, anybody listening or watching this, if you've never been that far out in the ocean, you can't see land. There's no land to be seen, even during daylight. If anybody kind of understands like the curvature of the Earth typically you can see out about 19 miles before the Earth starts curving, I believe. But at 20 nautical miles out, you're out there and you can't see any land whatsoever, day or night. Even at night, you're not even seeing lights yet. So that's how far out you are. We had to navigate, like I said, all the way from the drop point and to the 200-meter, designated pre-planned spot in the shoreline. So without a GPS to get us there, get you from point A to point B, we used a compass that was strapped onto the gunnel of the boat. So anybody that's seen a Zodiac boat, so if you haven't, Google it, Zodiac, Zodiac, Zodiac boat. We used F470 Zodiacs. They were these black, huge rubber boats, right? And inside of them, you would have like this aluminum flooring. At least we had those. And at least that's what the Marine Corps guys had us utilize. And I'll talk about that here in a minute. But anyway, on the gunnel, so you have the transom, which is the backboard of the boat with your 25 or 35 horsepower motor on the back. Or you do twin 25s, or maybe you have one single 35, or maybe you got a 50 horsepower, whatever. Anyway, so the positions there, you had the guy that's actually driving the boat with the arm, right? So as you're sitting on the big tube, which is called the gunnel, you got the coxswain. He's the one in charge of making sure that he's operating the motor. The guy next to him on the opposite side, right? Not next to him, like, if I'm sitting on the gunnel, he's not sitting next to me. He's sitting across from me, which was the A coxswain. And his job was to do all of the calculations with a latitude, longitude map of the ocean. And on that map, you had what was called a compass rose, right? So it was this big circle with a bunch of lines on there. And then, you had your latitude, longitude lines. Everything in latitude, longitude calculates by minute, second, minute, hour. And then the biggest two items that you needed to be able to do this D Street formula is you needed a watch to be able to keep time, and then you also needed a parallel ruler. So as you were moving, the A coxswain is sitting there moving the parallel ruler based off of the amount of time, and then as the coxswain, you've got this huge compass, right? And it's pretty big. I mean, if you look at my screen here, the compass is actually this big, and then it's on like this big frame, whether black frame or whatnot, and it goes down and it straps to the big gunnel, the big tube, and then as the coxswain, you've got your hand on the throttle. You're not looking anywhere else around the boat. You're not looking at the guys on the boat. You're not making sure they're doing their job. You're not looking at the A coxswain. You're not looking at him to see if he's doing his job. Your job is just to focus on the azimuth that you're going on. You have to listen to what the A coxswain's telling you. So at no time, so the guy, some people say, well, you're the one driving the boat. Like, how, what if you run into something? Well, that's what the scouts who are laying on the front of the boat, their job is to be able to scan for any obstacles or any type of possible threats to us as a team. So, but my job, if I was the coxswain, I would be looking straight into making sure that we are on the azimuth, the proper azimuth that we planned for, to be able to get from the drop point all the way to our target point. And typically the target point, even though I said we had to get within 200 meters of that the shoreline, we still had to stop roughly, we still had to stop roughly 1,000 to about 1,500 meters away from the shoreline to be able to, shut down the engine. Then we had to paddle our way to a little bit further in, maybe about 1,000 meters in, or from the shoreline, and then that's when we would drop our scout swimmers. They would swim, have their fins on. They would swim, ahead of the boat, go all the way up, and basically they're the ones who are going to secure, by fire. They're going to go and secure, like physically secure with their eyes and their weapon systems, to make sure that we don't, once again, we're not being, met with any threats once we get to the shore. So their job is to get up there and actually, make sure that we are good. The rest of the team is going to be protected. So if they were to come in contact, the whole team's not going to be in contact. They could always get, swim back to us, get in the boat, we'd take off, and then we can go on to our extraction plan at that point. However, that's what their jobs were. So anyway, kind of going down through notes here. Okay, so that was, that was stuff that we trained on. Like I said, it was part of the tasks that we trained on as a water team. But, like I said, we're in the Scout Swimmer course now. So this is just one portion of the training that we were doing. So when we first got there, we conducted a physical training test, or a PT test, like anybody else would, a 5-mile run, pool tests at the SEAL team compound at Norfolk. So since we were already at Fort Story, Virginia, which was the amphibious reconnaissance school, up the street in Norfolk was, there's SEAL teams 2 and 6. And, we use their compound to be able to do other water survival tasks, such as your combat water survival test, which is, consists of 3 different other tasks. The same kind of tasks I talked about in the Ranger School segment, where we were breaking ice into the water that morning. And then we did another 500-meter swim in uniform. And then we did recovery drills in helicopter rollovers in the water. So they have like a mock helicopter in the pool, and then you get strapped in the helicopter, and then what it does, it'll lower itself into the water, and then it'll rotate like you just landed in the ocean. And then you had to, safely and calmly, wait for the rotor blades, everything to stop. You might be upside down underwater at that point, but then you'd be looking at each other. You'd, unstrap yourselves, from the seatbelt, and then help each other out, and then move away to a designated rally point, and come up for air. So we would train on that as well. Then one of the great things about that course, they would never, one of the perks to the course, I guess, is it would get you up nice and early in the brisk, nice, cold September air in Virginia on the beach. And it was roughly about 3 to 4 in the morning. And we would conduct anywhere from about a 1 kilometer to 3 kilometer open water swim with our equipment in the Chesapeake Bay. That just prepped you for the rest of your day. That was every single morning. So, we may get done with training anywhere between, an early night would be 9 o'clock at night. A typical night is anywhere between 11 and midnight. And then you're back up at 3 a.m. with them banging trash cans and everything else, you getting all your equipment, taking the boats, or going down to the beach, and then getting in the water at 3:30, 4 a.m. And then you're conducting those open water swims. So needless to say, it was cold, and that's how we started off every single morning. So one of the funny times, one funny time, we were swimming, and a pod of dolphins came by to check us out. Anybody that's been in the Chesapeake Bay or up in there around that area, there's a lot of dolphins up there. And as we were swimming out there, they come by to check on us. They're harmless. They're not going to come out there. And it was actually kind of a good thing because wherever the dolphins are, typically they keep the sharks away. So you can do your research on that as well. But we were kind of grateful to actually have the dolphins. But the instructors, or the cadre there, they were in safety boats, and they yelled us to hurry up because there were sharks in the water. And I think what they wanted to do is see who actually you know, who's going to freak out. I mean, part of their job is just to make your life miserable. So of course the cadre, when they said all that, a few guys, who've never experienced anything like that before, they flipped out. I mean, they were going nuts, and here they are, we're in full equipment, fins, you get your rucksack, and, they're thinking, oh my God, there's sharks out here. So they flipped out and tried to overtake like the cadre's boat, which is the wrong answer. So the cadre, of course, they just kicked those guys right back out into the water. And for those who know, like, there's a distinct difference between dolphin and shark dorsal fins. It's not really too close. So watching those guys freak out made an already miserable situation that much better. So needless to say, we didn't let them in, we didn't let them live that down for the rest of the course for those guys there. That was pretty funny. So, but I can imagine, like, if you didn't know about anything like that, if you didn't know, if you weren't privy to that information that dolphins frequent that area, the cadre, they try to make your life miserable, but at the same time, they have fun, and it made for fun for the rest of us, but not for the guys that freaked out. So, and then as the course went on, the days, they get progressively harder, as they should with any good course or school. A lot of courses that are designed like that, they're not just there to teach you specific techniques, but also to challenge you both physically and mentally. We could see daily what guys came prepared and what guys didn't. I mean, it was pretty obvious, whether they were mentally there or mentally checked out, or, they let the conditions, dictate how, their psyche is going to play out that day. So, after about, I don't know, after the dark 30 swims, the 3:34 a.m. swims each morning, each assigned team would grab their assigned F470 Zodiac, along with all the equipment for the day, and head down to the beach. But there's a catch to that. It wasn't just an ordinary stroll. Each team had 6 to 7 person boat crews, all equipment, including rucksacks and anything else we needed. They were lashed down inside the boat. Each boat had aluminum floor inserts, kind of like I was talking about earlier, which make the boat significantly heavier. So this, along with the equipment, it made for some heavy weight, on your shoulders when you're conducting a high carry. So when you were going through that course, there were 2 carries that you were trained in: low carry and high carry. So low carry really is when you're trying to, you don't use it all that much, but you might use it when you're trying to get the boat out of the shore and into the hinterland. You might use a low carry for that. However, the way we were doing it is, since everything was strapped down inside the boat, we always went to a high carry. So instructors, they would pull guys off. So they would pull guys off the boat just to run laps or run ahead as part of the team as scouts, just to kind of make that challenge a little bit more significant for the team. So now you would have to be trained on, they would say, okay, if we had 6 guys on the boat, they'd pull 1 guy out or 2 guys out. Now you got 4 guys carrying this boat, and that just, it would demolish the 4 guys. And then the other 2 guys are going off running. They got to go run up to a certain point, then come back, and then swap out 2 other guys. I mean, it was just sheer fun, to say the least, I guess. But there was no easy route to the beach, of course. I mean, that we took every day. The cadre had a specific route, and it was almost entirely sand with a few large sand dunes along the way. So as you know, all the loose sand that you typically walk on the beach, you kind of maybe lose your footing. Think about carrying the hundreds and hundreds of pounds up on your shoulders, now climbing up over these sand dunes that are like so loose, and now you got guys falling down. I mean, it's just, you got to work as a team, and that's what they were trying to, not only just, build you physically and mentally, but they were trying to get you to work as a team as well. So the launch pad. So you would go over these two dunes, get all the way over there, and then you get to this launch pad is where we'd always board helicopters too. Whenever we did our, if we were being transported out to the ocean, if we were doing, helo insertions, we'd get up on the launch pads. Plus the launch pads were made for like like the hovercraft and everything else that would come on down through there, Navy hovercraft, some Army boats. Believe it or not, Army does have boats. So, but it would be a way or a platform. So those launch pads were a platform to be able to get very large military boats down. So our culminating event in the course was a 20 nautical mile over the horizon insertion. So we planned all day to conduct a reconnaissance surveillance mission against a specific target on land. We inserted somewhere around midnight into a pretty high sea state on Chinooks. We used the 10 by 10, the 10 by 10 insertion approach. So for those that don't know, so the way we'd get inside the helicopter, your boat would be in there, everything would be, all your equipment's lashed down in there. You'd have your bow line, so where your coxswain would hold on to the bow line. Your team members are also in there, they're behind you. So on the ramp, as the bird's coming in, so as the Chinook's coming in, if this is the water, right? Chinook's coming in to the water, and we call 10 and 10, talking 10 meters above the water and moving at 10 nautical miles an hour. So that way that you weren't just hauling butt in and over, and everybody's jumping out and getting, destroyed in the water, and, equipment's going everywhere. It's a 10 and 10 technique. So, so this is pretty standard. So the first to exit the tail of the ramp, like I said, is the coxswain, and the coxswain would hold on to the bow line. The bow line being the extended rope that's on the front of the bow or the front of the boat, right? So you'd hold on to that. And then as the cast master, which is typically the Army guy, or even one of our guys that are trained on cast mastering, and I'll get into that in episode 5B as far as specific duties and specialized duties of other stuff that I did while I was in the unit. You get trained on this stuff, cast master, spies master, fries master, all that other stuff. So you'd have a cast master there, and once he got the radio set on, listening to the pilots, and then once the pilots gave us the grid or the lat long to where we were supposed to drop off at, the coxswain or the cast master would give us the go ahead. So from here, boom, the ramp would drop down, the boat would you'd start to push the boat down just a little bit towards the end of the ramp, and then the cast master would say, cast off, go. So as a coxswain, you would push the boat out, and you would go out with the boat, not land in it, because that would hurt since they have the aluminum flooring in it. But you would hold on to the bow line and go out with the boat, and then the rest of the team would follow. And then once the rest of the team gets in there, then everybody gets into the boat, and then we get our bearings. We talk with the pilot, hey, everything, we're good to go. Kind of give them the thumbs up, and they can take off, and then we'll just start on our mission. So once everybody gets into the boat, we communicate with the aircraft, like I said, and then from there, we started heading towards our landing point. And during our water infiltration that night, it was pretty cold. I mean, like I said, in the sea state. So the sea state, if you don't understand what that is, so it's the rise and fall of the crest all the way down to the bottom of the waves, right? And these waves were huge. So sea state, so as you're trying to navigate, now you're going up and over all these waves in this little, 6 to 7 man boat, and it was crazy. And here you are trying to do, the A coxswain's doing the D Street formula. You're trying to keep your eyes directly on the compass as a coxswain. And man, it was kind of a mess. You got guys like almost falling out of the boat because of, the seas like knocking us all over the place. So, but on our team, we had, God rest his soul, we had Charlie Salinero. So anybody that watches this who knows Charlie Sal, phenomenal guy. He was awesome. Sal was a former Marine turned Army Ranger. So Sal, he was also very lean, muscular wise. And he was always like an avid fitness guru. He's probably about 1% body fat. He weighed about 150 pounds, soaking wet. He was one of those guys that he used to compete in like bodybuilding competitions. The guys that get up there and whatnot. But I remember we got about halfway to the shoreline, and we had to signal for a safety boat to come get him because his temperature was dropping pretty quickly. He was definitely showing signs of hypothermia. And once he was evacuated, we just continued on with the mission. But I'll never forget the sea state that night, along with how cold it was. And Charlie, like I said, God rest his soul, he passed away a couple of years ago. And, yeah, he was one of those guys that could not afford, didn't have like that extra lean or that extra body fat on him to keep him warm. So, it was just unfortunate. But anyway, so somewhere near the end of that course, exhausted, cold, and carrying more weight than I thought possible, I realized something. So for the first time in my Army career, I wasn't wondering if I belonged here anymore. I knew I did. So once we got back to Fort Bragg from the course, a bunch of us, we went out to party. We went out to go celebrate like we always did. And sometime that evening, I would eventually meet the woman who would become my first wife. So we'll discuss that later in another episode. But until then, stay aware, stay accountable, stay zeroed in.